Hello, welcome to True Inspirations. My name is Nathan, and today we're talking about the question of what is awakening? Now, there's a lot of misconceptions out there around what awakening is. Certainly the brochures look really nice when awakened teachers talk about awakening. Of course, there has to be some sort of incentive to seek it out and to put the energy into it in order for a practice to take hold. And so, what they describe in general is true, but is also situational and tends to get blown up by people's egos and projections and so forth. So, some of the things that people think about awakening and that I thought about awakening at one point was, if you're awake, that means that you're perfect. That means that you're kind and compassionate. That means that you could walk into the middle of traffic and just magically not be hit by any cars. There's all kinds of ideas out there as far as this sort of transcendent place that you get to where you're never bothered by anything. Nothing ever hurts you anymore. You don't experience sadness or fear or anger anymore. And for the most part, these are just projections. The ego is in such a state of suffering and unhappiness that it's sort of looking for the solution to that. And it figures that if what it is suffering from now is that it always gets angry or people are always getting angry at that person, then the solution to that will obviously entail no more anger. And there is a sense of equanimity that can come through awakening, but that's not what awakening is, at least in my opinion. And of course, what I'm presenting here is my perspective. Everybody has a different perspective, and I respect that. But today we're talking about what my personal experience and perspective is. And so for me, that's not really what awakening is. You're not transcending the human experience. You're actually becoming more grounded in it in a way. And the quality that differentiates the sort of dreaming human state versus the awakened state is separation consciousness. And in particular, the way that separation sort of, that consciousness of being separate and disconnected coalesces somehow into the experience of I. There's this sense of I somewhere in the consciousness. And so we call that the I sense, the sense of I. And what that is basically if you use the word I in a sentence, it refers to something. It refers to this particular being, this particular, whatever you think of yourself as a body, as a soul, as a spark of divinity, but whatever it is that you identify with, the I is referring to that. And at the center of that conceptual identity, there is a sense of I. There's something that makes I real. And that is the dreaming human state. That is, in a nutshell, what the ego is anything that says I and declares to the cosmos and anybody who will listen, here I am, I exist, hear me roar, whatever it is, every I has its own story and its own particular flavor of existence and interacting with others. But that is fundamentally what the ego is, and therefore what the dreaming human state is. And so awakening means getting to the point where that sense of I just completely drops away. And so what might that look like? If you still have a sense of I, it's very difficult to imagine that. And a lot of people, they'll project that means that you become this sort of zombie, that you disappear and your brain becomes mush and they put you in an institution where it's like you might as well be lobotomized. And that's because, we're so used to that sense of I sort of animating everything, animating our choices, animating our feelings, animating our sense of self, that naturally, if that were to disappear, the mind projects that it would be a disaster and you would just sort of melt into a puddle. But the I is separate from the personality, and the I is separate from the mind and the ability to function. So you can release that sense of I and not become, a blubbering zombie somewhere in the corner. It happens all the time. We have plenty of awake teachers out there who can vouch for the fact that once you lose the ego, once you lose the I, then there is an after that moment that is still functional and can be even more functional than what it was before. For some people, it's a shock. I've met people whose awakening was such a shock to their psyche that it really took them a lot of time to integrate that. One woman I know, after her awakening, she spent 3 months in bed and didn't leave the apartment, didn't do anything. And she just kept thinking to herself, God, you already killed me now, just finish me off. And that just kind of went on and on and on until one day it just was over. Whatever part of her needed to process in that way, ran out of gas. It did what it needed to do, and she got out of bed and went on with her life. But let's get back to how somebody who still is living with that sense of I might be able to understand what it means to not have an I. And one of my teachers, Rick Weinman, he's the one who's kind of mapped a lot of this out for me and for his students and his teaching. And he has a really great way of putting it, which is, if you think of yourself going to a party, and when you first get to the party, maybe you don't know anybody, and so there's a sense of kind of being closed off, feeling shy. Maybe you go over and just hang out with the snacks for a little while, and you're in your little bubble of shyness and contraction. And then over the course of the evening, you meet some people, you strike up some conversations, maybe you drink some alcohol, you get the social gears lubricated a bit. And then all of a sudden you're feeling really gregarious and you're open and you're having fun. And it's a completely different experience from where you were at the beginning. And yet there's something that was there in both situations. At the beginning, there was an experience of being contracted. And later, there was an experience of being expanded. And in both cases, there is consciousness, there's awareness, there's a thread throughout all of that. But there's a fundamental difference, and yet something remains. And with awakening, it's very similar. Right now there is a sense of I. There is a sense of being a particular being in the cosmos that is separate from everything and everybody else. And so that's sort of that beginning feeling of contraction. And then as you move into awakening, there is something shifts, and that sense of I drops away. And whatever it is there, whatever is your true self, is that thread that's there no matter what, whether there's an I sense there or no I sense anymore. In both situations, there is something, I might just call it awareness, so as not to get it too confusing. So there's this thread of awareness that can be aware of being an I or having the experience of being an I. And then there is that same awareness having the experience of not being an I. And so that's the difference. Experientially, that's the difference. Everybody's experience will be different. And to say that the I drops away isn't to say that there is no ego consciousness whatsoever. So there is a distinction between, say, the beginning of awakening, when the root, the core of that sense of I drops away. And then where you might be some years down the line, as you embody that movement, as you align with that and have that become more and more a daily part of your experience. As that embodies and deepens, there's less and less I consciousness, and there's more just sort of a spontaneous arising of thoughts and emotions and experience and so forth. So when my sense of I dropped away, or at least the core of it, and we'll talk about the difference between the core and everything else, I remember talking to my teacher and saying, well, okay, so there's this awakeness here, but I still see all these little squiggles of I consciousness just kind of floating around. And what's up with that? If I'm awake, how can there be all this I consciousness? And he said, well, you're awake, but they're not. There's all these little bits of consciousness still floating in the system that hold identity and that hold I consciousness. It's just that there's no anchor at the center of it, making me think that I am those different I's. They are just kind of floating around almost as a shadow sense of I. It's not the core fundamental, this is who I am. It's more like, that sort of feels familiar. And there's a sense of identity there. But if I look, that's actually not me. That actually has nothing to do with who I am. So, so that's in a nutshell, what awakening is. Anytime somebody talks about awakening, if they don't have that fundamental shift somewhere in the conversation, then they're just talking about something else. They're not talking about awakening from this Eastern Buddhist perspective. They're talking about whatever it is that they're talking about. So, so that's the fundamental difference. And a lot of people will say, well, you're already awake. Everybody's awake, all the time, and you just have to recognize it. In a certain sense, that's true. It's like, if you're dreaming, there's a part of you that always knows that you're dreaming, even if you're fully wrapped up in it and everything seems absolutely real, it's a different enough experience that we know it's not real. And as soon as you wake up like that, you recognize, oh no, none of that was real. It doesn't take very long to recognize that however real it felt in the moment, it's actually not. It's not real. And it's similar with this sense of I. No matter how many eons you've been incarnating as this sense of I, there is some spark down in the very, very center of all that, way, way deep down somewhere, that knows what it is. That spark of divinity or that spark of awake consciousness always knows what it is. It's just sort of subsumed under all these layers of conditioning and identity and so forth. And so there is a certain truth to the idea that everybody is already awake, but that's not a very helpful thing to say. That doesn't really help us to understand the difference between, how most people experience themselves and then what it means to be in this, awake state that people talk about. And that's because there's a difference between some part of you deep down inside knowing that you are, knowing what you are, knowing that you're awake, and actually living it and experiencing it on a conscious level. Now, that everything, up to that point that we're talking about is basically what I would call the beginning of awakening or basic awakening. There's more beyond that. When that sense of I drops away, in that moment, and as you explore that sensation and that experience, it becomes really clear that all the things that you thought you were, you actually aren't. As far as your identities around your body, your family, your job, your emotions, your philosophies, your ideologies, all these things that you really held as being you, it becomes much easier to see that they actually are not you. That's just kind of the weather passing across the awareness of your mind, across the screen of your awareness. You can think of it that way. And let's see. And so there's a fundamental shift there where you're not identified with all of that, and that's not you, but you don't necessarily know what you are yet. That initial awakening just breaks you out of the dream of what you thought you were. And from there, there's some clues as to what you really are. And you might be able to sort of stitch together a sense of what that is. But there are deeper awakenings beyond that that help you to connect to what you really are, which from my perspective, I would use the word divinity, that we're all divinity incarnate. I've done a Zoom call about what divinity is and how we all are a part of that. But that kind of comes later. There's sort of the letting go of what you thought you were. And then as time goes on and as you deepen into it, then you start to feel more of what you are. And awakening does that. There's this kind of interesting dance where in the beginning, there's this emptiness. Your consciousness had been so full of this I consciousness and this I sense and all the drama that goes along with it, that when that drops away, then there's just a sense of kind of peacefulness and emptiness, and it's just pleasant. You're just in an open, free space. As that deepens, that emptiness gets deeper as well, and then eventually gets to the point where the emptiness flips and becomes full. And this is where in Eastern practice, they'll talk about being and non-being. What is non-existent and what is exists are basically two sides of the same coin. And in terms of awakening, there is that exact dynamic where emptiness is form, form is emptiness. And as you go deeper and deeper into the emptiness of awakening, eventually something tips and it goes from, I'll see if I'll just kind of project this. You go from a state of just emptiness, very, very deep emptiness. And then it flips into fullness. And both are expressions of awakeness. And it'll keep doing that. It'll keep going back and forth and as you dive deeper and deeper into it. So there's a whole process that doesn't end with the initial awakening. That's, in some sense, it's just the beginning of the journey. And then some people stop there. They were in it for the awakening. They're in it for the peace that would give them. And once they get that, then they're happy to just go on into their lives and just live very normal lives, just like everybody else does. And other people, they get there and there's still something driving them. There's still something pushing towards a deeper alignment with awakeness or with truth or with reality. And so they keep going. And that's been my path. I'm just insatiably curious as to what ultimate reality is and how close can I get to that in this human form, and what would it be like for ultimate reality to experience life through this particular form. I only have a few decades left at most to explore that and have that experience for whatever aspect of divinity that this form is here for. So that's the framework that I work from here in terms of what is awakening. Awakening is when the sense of I drops away and there is just awake consciousness in its place, which is very still and very empty and also very full and beautiful and vibrant all at the same time. And when that happens, even though there's still all the conditioning that is still there, I mean, the amount of conditioning that we have is really vast, even when you get to the point where you've worked through enough of it that there's space to awaken. Even after that awakening, there's still a lot of conditioning that's going to play out. And that's fine. That's just what it is to be in a form like this. But that there's space from that conditioning. You're not as identified with it. And the more space there is from it and the less you identify with it, the less it can sort of reach up and grab you and pull you into the maelstrom of its drama. And its drama, the drama of the ego, is basically opposition to reality. The only way that the ego can exist is through this constant motion where it stays ahead of the truth, where it stays ahead of reality. And it defines itself. The way that you create a bubble that is separate from the rest of the cosmos is to go into opposition with everything that you experience. And of course, that's not what we're all doing all the time. We're not always in complete conflict. That's because there is a mixture of our natural divinity, just sort of being and expressing joy and love and peacefulness and so forth, along with the ego that's existing in its opposition to reality.